4:47 a.m., Tuesday, October 18, 1983. International Cargo Apron. By the time the first wave of passengers reached the terminal, most of the airport's most important work had already begun. Floodlights washed across rows of parked aircraft while diesel baggage tractors moved in carefully timed loops between sorting facilities and loading ramps. Every suitcase, cargo container, and transfer pouch followed a route determined hours before sunrise. Ground crews measured their shifts not by clocks alone, but by aircraft registration numbers, departure windows, and the narrow intervals separating one arrival from the next. In an environment where thousands of individual movements blended into a single uninterrupted system, routine became the airport's greatest safeguard against disorder. It was during one of those ordinary pre-dawn loading cycles that a single hard-shell suitcase briefly broke the rhythm. The baggage entered conveyor line 4 with a standard international transfer tag attached to its handle, yet it never reached the loading cart assigned to its documented flight. Instead, a supervisor with no responsibility for transfer baggage quietly redirected the case toward a maintenance access corridor normally reserved for aircraft equipment. The diversion lasted less than 40 seconds. No alarms sounded. No paperwork appeared to be altered. Within minutes, the same suitcase emerged from another service door carrying an identical baggage tag and continued toward an outbound aircraft as though nothing unusual had occurred. Hundreds of employees worked within sight of the exchange. None appeared to notice. One of them did. David Mercer had worked as an airline baggage handler for nearly 12 years. His responsibilities were neither glamorous nor particularly visible. He loaded aircraft holds, verified baggage counts, balanced cargo weight, checked routing labels, and ensured that transfer luggage reached connecting flights before departure deadlines expired. The work demanded physical endurance, but its greater challenge lay in maintaining consistency under relentless pressure. Every aircraft represented a mathematical problem of timing, weight distribution, and procedural accuracy. Mistakes delayed departures, misplaced luggage across continents, and generated investigations that few ground employees wished to experience. Unlike passengers, Mercer viewed the airport as a machine rather than a destination. He rarely remembered travelers' faces. Instead, he remembered container numbers, conveyor sequences, loading priorities, and aircraft parking positions. Years spent repeating identical procedures had trained him to recognize subtle deviations almost instinctively. He did not possess extraordinary intuition. He simply knew what normal looked like after watching it thousands of times. The diverted suitcase registered only as another deviation. By the end of his shift, the incident had almost disappeared beneath the demands of unloading incoming aircraft and preparing afternoon departures. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, the image remained unexpectedly clear. The supervisor involved did not normally work transfer operations. Maintenance corridors were not approved shortcuts for international baggage. Most importantly, the diversion solved no obvious operational problem. It simply happened. The following morning unfolded much like every other. Wide-body aircraft arrived from Europe shortly after dawn. Domestic flights crowded the departure schedule before noon. Cargo pallets containing electronics, pharmaceuticals, machine components, and diplomatic freight rolled through separate inspection channels while baggage handlers raced against aircraft turnaround schedules measured in minutes rather than hours. Radios crackled with gate changes. Fuel trucks crossed service roads. Customs officers inspected selected shipments while airline dispatchers updated manifests almost continuously. Everything appeared exactly as airport operations were designed to appear, organized movement concealed beneath controlled urgency. Mercer followed his assigned routes without interruption. His work placed him in nearly every baggage processing zone over the course of a normal week. Some days he remained on inbound international arrivals. Other shifts assigned him to domestic transfers or oversized cargo. The constant rotation gave him an unusually broad understanding of how the airport functioned as a complete logistical system rather than as isolated departments. He understood which delays were common. He understood which paperwork errors occurred every week. He understood how weather disrupted baggage sequencing. He understood when supervisors improvised solutions because aircraft schedules demanded flexibility. Equally important, he understood which procedures almost never changed. During the final loading period 3 days later, another familiar detail surfaced. A nearly identical hard-shell suitcase entered the transfer system on a flight arriving from Western Europe. Its exterior showed almost no travelware despite carrying tags suggesting multiple international connections. The baggage label listed an onward destination requiring customs verification before transfer, yet the case bypassed the expected inspection queue after receiving a handwritten routing amendment from an administrative office located several buildings away from cargo operations. Again, nothing appeared overtly suspicious. Administrative corrections occurred every day. Passengers missed connections. Documentation required updates. Special handling occasionally overrode standard routing. Yet Mercer noticed something difficult to explain. The handwriting authorizing the amendment matched the same compact block lettering he remembered from paperwork associated with the earlier suitcase. He made no report. He mentioned nothing to co-workers. There was still nothing to report beyond a vague impression that two unrelated events resembled one another. Weeks passed. Autumn weather gradually shortened daylight across the airfield. Morning fog occasionally delayed arrivals. Holiday freight slowly increased cargo volume as airlines prepared for heavier international traffic. Ground crews worked overtime. Supervisors reassigned personnel frequently to compensate for staffing shortages. The airport grew busier without becoming noticeably different. Mercer's routine remained almost unchanged. He parked before dawn, entered through the employee security checkpoint, collected protective equipment, reviewed loading assignments, and spent the next 8 to 10 hours moving luggage through a logistical network that functioned with remarkable precision. Lunch breaks rarely occurred at predictable times. Shift endings depended entirely upon delayed arrivals and late departures. Outside work, his life followed similarly restrained patterns. He rented a modest apartment less than 20 minutes from the airport because unpredictable schedules made long commutes impractical. Evenings consisted mostly of quiet meals, maintenance around the apartment, and enough sleep to return before sunrise. Friends occasionally questioned why he remembered aircraft registration numbers more easily than birthdays. He usually laughed and blamed repetition. In truth, repetition had become the foundation of his profession. It also became the foundation of his growing concern. By early November, Mercer had observed the unusual suitcases 5 separate times. Each appeared on international transfer flights. Each arrived during periods of unusually heavy operational traffic. Each briefly disappeared from standard baggage processing before returning to the system. Each involved paperwork carrying similar handwritten modifications. Most curious of all, each departed aboard different airlines despite following remarkably similar transfer timelines. He began paying closer attention not because he believed he had discovered criminal activity, but because airports rewarded employees who noticed irregularities before they became operational problems. Mechanical failures often announced themselves through small inconsistencies. Documentation errors accumulated gradually. Security breaches usually appeared ordinary until reconstructed afterward. Professional experience had taught him that patterns mattered more than isolated incidents. As November progressed, additional details quietly joined the pattern. Certain baggage tags appeared newer than surrounding luggage despite representing supposedly long international journeys. Several suitcases consistently occupied identical loading positions inside aircraft containers regardless of passenger destination. One particular baggage tractor, assigned to no fixed route, appeared repeatedly whenever the unusual luggage entered cargo operations. The same 2 supervisors, although employed in different departments, seemed unusually present during those transfers. None of these observations proved anything. Each possessed an innocent explanation. Together, however, they resisted coincidence. Mercer never abandoned his responsibilities to investigate. Instead, he relied upon memory developed through years of repetitive work. He mentally noted flight numbers without writing them down. Aircraft tail numbers became familiar. Departure times settled into rough sequences inside his head. Without intending to conduct an investigation, he found himself comparing today's baggage movement against last week's and last month's. The airport itself offered no answers. Its immense scale concealed anomalies beneath constant activity. Tens of thousands of bags passed through the system every week. Administrative exceptions occurred by the hundreds. Temporary rerouting happened daily. To anyone lacking intimate familiarity with airport logistics, the irregular suitcases would have disappeared into statistical noise. Mercer possessed precisely the familiarity that made the pattern visible. He still assumed he was missing some administrative explanation unavailable to ground crews. Perhaps the luggage belonged to government couriers. Perhaps customs procedures differed for certain international agreements. Perhaps maintenance inspections required temporary rerouting he simply had never encountered before. Reasonable explanations remained plentiful. Yet each explanation weakened as the observations accumulated. Near the end of another pre-dawn shift, while securing cargo containers beside an outbound international aircraft, Mercer watched the familiar hardshell suitcase arrive once again. The baggage paused exactly where it had no operational reason to stop. A supervisor glanced briefly toward the maintenance corridor. A service vehicle rolled between two loading carts, blocking visibility for only a few seconds. When the vehicle cleared, the suitcase continued toward the aircraft exactly as before. Nothing appeared missing. Nothing appeared altered. Everything resumed its ordinary rhythm. For everyone else on the ramp, the moment vanished into another hectic morning at one of the country's busiest airports. For David Mercer, it confirmed something he could no longer dismiss. Whatever was happening had happened before. And unless someone had been quietly watching the same routine for months, no one else seemed likely to notice it. The weeks following David Mercer's growing suspicions unfolded with deceptive normalcy. Aircraft continued arriving within minutes of their published schedules, baggage trains crossed the service roads in carefully choreographed patterns, and departure boards changed with mechanical precision throughout each day. Nothing about the airport suggested that anything unusual was taking place. Its greatest disguise remained its efficiency. Every hour generated thousands of legitimate movements, making the rare anomaly almost impossible to distinguish from routine operational variation. Mercer resisted the temptation to draw conclusions. 12 years working on the ramp had taught him that assumptions created mistakes. A delayed customs inspection could resemble a security diversion. A last-minute aircraft substitution often required baggage to be rerouted through maintenance corridors. Government shipments occasionally operated under procedures unfamiliar to ordinary airline employees. Experience encouraged skepticism not only toward unusual events, but toward one's own interpretations of them. Instead of searching for evidence, he searched for consistency. Beginning in mid-November 1983, he relied entirely on memory during his shifts, reviewing each day's observations only after returning home. A small notebook, originally intended for tracking overtime hours and rotating schedules, gradually became a chronological record of operational irregularities. He wrote only objective details, dates, approximate times, flight numbers, aircraft registrations, loading bay assignments, baggage container identifiers, weather conditions, and which supervisors happened to be present. The entries contained no theories. If the pattern proved meaningless, the notes would remain nothing more than a record of ordinary airport operations. Within 3 weeks, repetition began replacing coincidence. The unusual hard-shell suitcases appeared almost exclusively on Tuesday and Thursday morning transfer banks, arriving from several different European cities before continuing to destinations elsewhere in North America or the Caribbean. Although the airlines changed, the timing remained remarkably similar. Each suitcase entered the baggage system during periods when multiple international arrivals overlapped, creating maximum congestion across customs facilities and transfer conveyors. Operational pressure, Mercer realized, created concealment far more effectively than secrecy. He also noticed that the suitcases were never loaded first or last. Instead, they consistently occupied the middle portion of each aircraft loading sequence, when baggage crews worked fastest and supervisory attention shifted toward departure deadlines rather than individual luggage. It was a subtle detail, but one that reflected planning rather than chance. Another pattern quietly emerged. Every unusual transfer coincided with the presence of a compact white airport utility vehicle assigned, according to its markings, to facilities maintenance. Mercer knew enough about airport operations to recognize that maintenance departments occasionally crossed into cargo areas when equipment required repair. Yet this particular vehicle never appeared to stop beside damaged conveyors or malfunctioning loading equipment. It simply arrived near whichever aircraft handled the recurring luggage before disappearing again within minutes. He eventually memorized its fleet identification number. The number itself meant nothing. Its consistency did. By early December, Mercer expanded his observations beyond baggage movement. Instead of watching only the suitcases, he began paying attention to the people surrounding them. The same cargo supervisor appeared during 4 consecutive transfers despite technically belonging to another airline's ground operations contract. 2 administrative coordinators signed revised transfer forms on different dates using identical blue ink and nearly identical handwriting. A loading foreman who rarely left domestic operations happened to inspect international baggage containers immediately before each irregular transfer. Individually, every observation possessed an innocent explanation. Collectively, they suggested coordination. Mercer remained careful never to alter his own routine. He reported to work at the same time, accepted whichever assignments dispatch issued, and performed every task according to established procedures. Curiosity was one thing. Drawing attention to himself was another. Airports function through hierarchy, and employees who wandered outside their responsibilities quickly attracted unwanted questions from supervisors. Observation, therefore, became an exercise in patience. He learned that the unusual luggage always traveled with professionally attached baggage tags bearing only minor signs of replacement. Tiny adhesive residue remained beneath the newest labels, indicating earlier routing information had been removed. Such changes occurred occasionally when passengers missed connections, but not with the frequency appearing in Mercer's notebook. Weight also became significant. Experienced baggage handlers developed an instinctive sense for the mass of ordinary luggage. A suitcase declared to contain clothing felt different from one carrying machine parts or printed documents. The recurring hard shell cases consistently weighed more than their dimensions suggested. They remained manageable for one person yet noticeably heavier than similarly sized passenger baggage. No regulation had been violated. Nothing required inspection. Yet Mercer found himself remembering each case long after it disappeared into an aircraft cargo hold. December brought heavier passenger traffic. Holiday schedules compressed turnaround times across the airport. Seasonal employees joined ground crews, overtime became routine, and supervisors concentrated almost entirely on maintaining departure punctuality. Under ordinary circumstances, such congestion would have disrupted any carefully organized operation. Instead, the unusual transfers became even smoother. Administrative amendments appeared faster than before. Vehicles arrived with greater precision. The recurring suitcases never missed a connection despite delays affecting dozens of ordinary passengers each day. Efficiency itself had become suspicious. Mercer began comparing aircraft routes rather than individual flights. He discovered that the luggage rarely followed the shortest path between origin and destination. Instead, it passed through airports known for substantial international cargo operations, often adding unnecessary transfer points before reaching its declared final stop. Commercial airlines generally minimized connections whenever possible. These routes appeared intentionally indirect. Without realizing it, Mercer had stopped watching luggage and started watching a logistical system. Late one Thursday morning, freezing rain delayed several European arrivals by nearly 90 minutes. The resulting congestion overwhelmed baggage sorting operations, forcing supervisors to redirect multiple transfer containers into temporary holding areas while departure schedules were revised. For the first time since Mercer had begun keeping notes, the recurring suitcase failed to follow its familiar sequence. Instead of entering the maintenance corridor, it remained inside an overflow staging zone alongside dozens of ordinary passenger bags awaiting reassignment. The interruption lasted barely 15 minutes. During that period, Mercer observed something he had not previously noticed. A middle-aged man wearing a plain dark overcoat entered the restricted baggage area accompanied by neither airline personnel nor airport security. He carried no visible identification beyond a small clipped credential turned inward against his jacket. He neither handled luggage nor spoke with baggage crews. Instead, he quietly reviewed several transfer documents presented by an administrative coordinator before leaving through an access door leading toward airport offices. His appearance generated remarkably little attention. Employees continued working. Vehicles continued moving. No introductions occurred. Yet within minutes of his departure, the delayed suitcase resumed its familiar path through the maintenance corridor before reaching its outbound aircraft with only seconds remaining before cargo doors closed. Mercer added another entry to his notebook. He described the individual only by observable facts: approximate age, height, clothing, time of arrival, direction of travel, and the sequence of events before and after his appearance. Personal descriptions, he reminded himself, faded quickly. Timelines did not. The notebook had grown thick enough to reveal patterns impossible to recognize from memory alone. Every recorded irregularity intersected with at least one other observation. Dates aligned. Vehicles repeated. Supervisors overlapped. Flight schedules formed recurring cycles lasting roughly 3 weeks before beginning again with different aircraft in different airlines. Whatever system operated inside the airport adapted to changing schedules while preserving its own internal rhythm. Mercer considered reporting his concerns to airport management. He rejected the idea almost immediately. He possessed no evidence of criminal activity. He had witnessed no theft, no violence, no tampered luggage, and no unauthorized access that could not potentially be explained through procedures beyond his security clearance. Presenting only speculation risked discrediting legitimate observations before anyone examined them carefully. Patience remained the wiser course. He decided upon a single objective. Rather than documenting every unusual transfer indefinitely, he would determine whether the recurring suitcases shared one identifiable characteristic impossible to dismiss as coincidence. If that characteristic existed, it would justify taking the matter beyond ordinary supervisory channels. If it did not, he would close the notebook and return to treating the incidents as operational curiosities. On the morning of January 5, 1984, winter storms across the eastern seaboard forced airlines to revise dozens of international schedules. Aircraft arrived out of sequence, departure gates changed repeatedly, and baggage destined for connecting flights accumulated throughout the transfer facility. Amid the disruption, Mercer recognized another familiar hardshell suitcase emerging from conveyor line 4. Unlike previous occasions, its baggage tag had partially separated from the handle after passing through the sorting system. For the first time in nearly 3 months of quiet observation, a detail normally hidden beneath layers of routing labels became briefly visible. It was not the destination that caught his attention. It was the faded outline of an older identification strip beneath the newest tag. The adhesive marks suggested the suitcase had carried and removed multiple routing labels in rapid succession, far more than any ordinary passenger itinerary could reasonably require. Mercer watched the case disappear toward the same maintenance corridor he had documented for weeks. He did not move after it. He simply closed the cargo container, completed the loading checklist, and wrote one final note before ending his shift. For the first time since the pattern had begun, he no longer believed he was watching administrative coincidence. He believed someone was deliberately hiding the true journey of a suitcase that was never intended to follow the route printed on its tag. The entry David Mercer wrote on the evening of January 5, 1984, differed from every previous note in his notebook. For nearly 3 months he had documented patterns, schedules, and recurring procedures without attempting to interpret them. That discipline had prevented ordinary operational irregularities from becoming imagined conspiracies. Yet the repeated appearance of concealed routing labels altered the nature of his observations. Someone was not merely moving luggage through unusual channels. Someone was deliberately obscuring where certain suitcases had actually traveled. The notebook remained locked inside a kitchen drawer until his next shift. Mercer returned to the airport before dawn as he always had, determined not to interrupt whatever process he had been quietly observing. His objective was no longer to discover something extraordinary. It was to determine whether the concealed routing labels represented an isolated anomaly or the defining feature of every suspicious transfer. Over the following 8 days, winter weather repeatedly disrupted international schedules. Heavy crosswinds delayed inbound aircraft from Western Europe, forcing airline dispatchers to compress baggage transfers into shorter operational windows. Supervisors reassigned loading crews with little notice, creating exactly the kind of disorder Mercer expected would interrupt any carefully organized system. Instead, the opposite occurred. The unusual luggage continued moving with remarkable precision. While ordinary passengers occasionally missed connecting flights because delayed baggage failed to reach departure gates in time, the recurring hardshell suitcases never experienced similar setbacks. Revised loading orders consistently favored them, even when doing so required adjustments affecting dozens of unrelated bags. Mercer found the efficiency difficult to explain. Commercial airlines protected departure schedules above everything else. They did not normally prioritize individual passenger luggage unless special circumstances required it. Yet the same anonymous suitcases repeatedly received treatment resembling operational priority without displaying the markings associated with diplomatic baggage, medical shipments, or officially declared government cargo. The pattern had become too consistent to ignore. On January 16, another opportunity emerged. An arriving international flight experienced a mechanical fault immediately after parking at the gate. Maintenance personnel requested access beneath the aircraft while baggage unloading continued through temporary procedures. The unexpected interruption forced ground crews to stage several transfer containers beside an unused cargo warehouse until clearance was restored. For the first time, Mercer found himself working within a few feet of one of the recurring suitcases for nearly 20 minutes. He neither opened nor disturbed it. His responsibilities did not permit such actions, and years of professional discipline prevented curiosity from overriding procedure. Instead, he examined only details visible to every baggage handler. The suitcase carried a fresh baggage tag issued less than 24 hours earlier. Beneath the handle remained faint impressions from at least 3 previously removed adhesive labels. Its shell displayed surprisingly little wear despite supposedly passing through multiple international airports. The reinforced corners suggested commercial manufacture, yet the construction appeared unusually rigid for ordinary passenger luggage. Most striking of all, the case felt disproportionately heavy when repositioned inside the transfer container. Not impossibly heavy, but dense in a manner inconsistent with clothing or personal belongings. Mercer completed his assigned work without hesitation. Before the suitcase continued toward its outbound aircraft, however, an administrative coordinator approached carrying revised paperwork. The documents were exchanged quickly. The original transfer manifest disappeared into a leather portfolio. A replacement sheet bearing different routing instructions accompanied the baggage instead. The exchange lasted no longer than 15 seconds. No signatures were requested from the loading crew. No explanation was offered. Everyone resumed work. Mercer watched the paperwork rather than the suitcase. For weeks he had assumed the luggage represented the center of the operation. Now he suspected the documentation mattered even more. That evening he reviewed every note accumulated since October. A clearer chronology emerged. The suitcases varied slightly in appearance, airline, and destination. The paperwork followed nearly identical timing every single time. Administrative revisions consistently occurred after customs processing but before final aircraft loading. The changes originated from different offices yet appeared remarkably uniform in format. Whatever system existed depended upon documentation moving just as carefully as the baggage itself. Mercer reached a conclusion he could no longer postpone. The notebook had exceeded personal curiosity. It now contained observations requiring formal attention. Rather than approaching airline management, he requested a private meeting with the airport's internal security office responsible for operational irregularities. The appointment was scheduled for the afternoon of January 19, after completion of his morning shift. The meeting remained deliberately uneventful. Mercer presented himself not as a whistleblower but as an employee uncertain whether repeated procedural inconsistencies warranted review. He produced the notebook only after explaining that its contents represented chronological observations recorded immediately after each shift rather than reconstructed memories. Airport Security Supervisor Thomas Ellison listened without interruption. Years of investigating cargo theft, forged credentials, and smuggling attempts had taught him that most employee reports originated from misunderstandings. Nevertheless, Mercer's notes differed from typical complaints. They contained dates instead of opinions. Aircraft registrations instead of rumors. Loading positions instead of speculation. Ellison asked only factual questions. How often had the same vehicles appeared? Which supervisors repeatedly entered the timeline? Had Mercer ever witnessed anyone opening the luggage? Had any baggage disappeared entirely? The answers remained cautious. No luggage had vanished. No visible crime had occurred. No unauthorized searches had been observed. Only an increasingly organized pattern of procedural exceptions extending across nearly 3 months. Ellison requested permission to retain photocopies of the notebook. Mercer agreed. Within 48 hours, airport security quietly compared the documented flight numbers against archived operational records. Several observations proved immediately verifiable. The maintenance vehicle Mercer had repeatedly noted possessed no recorded work orders matching the locations and times described in his entries. Administrative routing amendments existed, yet several lacked complete authorization records explaining why they had been issued. Certain baggage transfer forms had disappeared entirely from airport archives despite corresponding flights appearing in airline databases. What began as an employee concern slowly evolved into an administrative investigation. Airport security deliberately avoided alerting airline supervisors connected to Mercer's observations. Instead, officials expanded their review to include baggage documentation, customs processing records, employee access logs, and vehicle movement reports covering the previous 6 months. The inconsistencies multiplied. By the final week of January, Ellison contacted federal transportation authorities, requesting assistance in evaluating documentation irregularities extending beyond normal airport jurisdiction. The inquiry remained confidential. Routine operations continued without visible change. Mercer received no additional instructions beyond continuing his work exactly as before. On February 2, 1984, 2 federal investigators arrived at the airport without identifying their agencies to ordinary staff. They spent most of the day reviewing records rather than interviewing employees. Only late that afternoon did they request a private meeting with Mercer. The interview focused almost entirely upon observation techniques. How had he recognized the pattern? Why had he waited before reporting it? Could he distinguish the recurring suitcases from ordinary baggage without consulting his notebook? Mercer explained that nothing about a single transfer appeared remarkable. Only repetition revealed the anomaly. Experienced baggage handlers remembered routines the way musicians remembered rhythm. When one note repeatedly fell outside the expected sequence, the difference became impossible to ignore. The investigators seemed less interested in the luggage than in the precision of Mercer's chronology. His notebook allowed them to reconstruct nearly 4 months of airport activity minute by minute. Flight arrivals. Vehicle appearances. Supervisor assignments. Documentation changes. Transfer routes. For the first time, separate administrative records could be compared against a continuous independent timeline maintained by someone with no investigative responsibilities. The chronology exposed something airport officials had overlooked. The suspicious transfers followed an operational cycle repeating approximately every 21 days. Flight numbers changed. Airlines changed. Destinations changed. The underlying sequence did not. Late in the interview, one investigator placed several photocopied baggage manifests beside Mercer's notebook. Each contained routing amendments identical to those he had described. Each also carried authorization codes that did not correspond to any active transportation security office. The codes belonged to organizations that either no longer existed or possessed no authority over commercial baggage operations. The room remained silent for several moments. No one attempted to explain the discrepancy. The investigators gathered the documents, thanked Mercer for his cooperation, and informed him that the matter had moved beyond ordinary airport security procedures. They instructed him not to discuss the investigation with co-workers, supervisors, or family members. More importantly, they asked him to continue working exactly as he always had. Nothing about his routine was to change. Mercer returned to the baggage ramp the following morning beneath the same floodlights that had greeted him every shift for more than a decade. Aircraft continued arriving. Conveyor belts continued moving. Supervisors issued loading assignments. To every employee around him, the airport appeared completely unchanged. Yet somewhere beyond the ordinary routines of baggage handling, federal investigators had begun reconstructing the same pattern he had spent months quietly recording. And for the first time since the investigation began, Mercer realized the recurring suitcases might represent only the most visible part of a much larger operation hidden inside the airport's daily routine. By the middle of February 1984, the investigation had quietly expanded beyond airport administration. The officials now reviewing David Mercer's notebook no longer approached the irregular baggage transfers as isolated violations of airline procedure. Instead, they treated them as components of a structured logistical network whose true purpose remained undefined. Every observation Mercer had recorded was entered into a growing timeline that combined airport records, employee schedules, vehicle movements, customs documentation, and archived flight manifests. What had begun as a baggage handler's careful attention to routine was gradually becoming a counterintelligence inquiry. Mercer's role changed very little. That was intentional. Federal investigators instructed him to continue working without altering his habits, avoiding any behavior that might suggest increased interest in the recurring transfers. He was not asked to gather evidence, confront co-workers, or monitor specific individuals. His greatest value remained his normal presence within the airport. Any noticeable change in routine risked alerting whoever had organized the operation. The investigation therefore shifted almost entirely away from Mercer and toward surveillance. Airport records revealed that the recurring maintenance vehicle had entered restricted cargo zones on 14 documented occasions during the previous 6 months. Its electronic access logs corresponded closely with the dates Mercer had recorded in his notebook. Yet maintenance requests filed for those same periods described equipment inspections that never actually occurred. The paperwork existed. The mechanical repairs did not. Investigators quietly expanded their review. Security camera recordings from cargo ramps, warehouse entrances, and service roads were collected before routine archival deletion could erase them. Individual recordings rarely revealed anything remarkable. Employees loaded baggage. Vehicles crossed service lanes. Supervisors inspected containers. Viewed separately, every recording appeared entirely ordinary. Viewed chronologically, however, recurring faces and vehicles emerged with unmistakable regularity. One administrative coordinator appeared shortly before nearly every documented transfer. A facilities maintenance vehicle consistently entered loading zones without performing visible maintenance work. The same cargo supervisor approved routing amendments regardless of which airline technically controlled the flight. None of these individuals interacted long enough to attract attention. Their significance emerged only when months of surveillance footage were compared frame by frame. The federal investigators resisted immediate intervention. Counterintelligence inquiries depended upon understanding networks rather than arresting isolated participants. If the operation truly involved compartmentalized logistics, removing one individual too early might permanently conceal everyone else. Instead, surveillance intensified. Several employees whose names appeared repeatedly in Mercer's timeline became subjects of discrete background investigations. Financial records, travel histories, employment files, and access permissions were reviewed under judicial authorization. Investigators searched not for dramatic evidence but for patterns inconsistent with ordinary airport employment. Most records appeared entirely unremarkable. The cargo supervisor had worked at the airport for nearly 18 years. The administrative coordinator possessed excellent performance evaluations. The maintenance driver had no disciplinary history. Their professional lives reflected stability rather than suspicion. Yet small irregularities gradually accumulated. The coordinator regularly accessed baggage documentation outside assigned responsibilities. The maintenance employee requested overtime almost exclusively during weeks corresponding to the 21-day operational cycle. The cargo supervisor occasionally remained on airport property hours after scheduled shifts had ended without recording additional work time. None of these actions violated policy. Together they suggested deliberate coordination. Federal analysts then reconstructed the movement of the suspicious suitcases after they departed the airport. Airline records showed that several bags listed on original transfer manifests disappeared from subsequent destination documentation. New baggage numbers appeared in their place without generating missing luggage reports from passengers. Somewhere between departure and arrival, the identities of selected suitcases effectively changed while the baggage itself continued moving uninterrupted through international transportation systems. The investigation entered a new phase. Late in February, investigators requested authority to monitor one expected transfer more closely. Rather than intercepting the luggage immediately, they observed every stage of its movement through the airport. Cameras followed the suitcase from arrival until aircraft loading. Employee positions were mapped minute by minute. Every administrative document associated with the transfer was photographed before and after routing amendments appeared. The resulting timeline confirmed Mercer's observations with extraordinary precision. Exactly 17 minutes after customs processing concluded, the suitcase entered the maintenance corridor. It remained beyond public visibility for 34 seconds. When it emerged, its external appearance remained unchanged. The accompanying paperwork did not. Investigators recovered duplicate copies of both routing documents after departure. Microscopic examination later revealed that although the passenger information remained identical, internal control codes printed near the document margins had been altered. Those codes directed baggage through separate tracking systems invisible to ordinary airline personnel. Someone possessed access not only to luggage but also to the administrative architecture governing international baggage movement. At that point, investigators sought judicial authorization to intercept the next scheduled transfer before departure. The opportunity arrived on March 8, 1984. Heavy rain delayed outbound aircraft throughout the morning, compressing multiple international departures into overlapping loading windows. Amid the congestion, another familiar hardshell suitcase entered the transfer facility. Everything unfolded according to the established pattern. The maintenance vehicle appeared. Administrative paperwork changed hands. The baggage briefly disappeared from standard routing. Only this time, federal officers quietly intervened before the suitcase reached its outbound aircraft. The examination occurred inside a secure inspection facility away from airline personnel and ordinary airport operations. Chain of custody procedures were documented from the moment the luggage entered the room. Photographs recorded its exterior condition. Fingerprints were collected before any further examination. Customs representatives observed each stage to preserve evidentiary integrity. The suitcase itself revealed little. Its locking mechanism appeared commercially manufactured. Its interior initially contained ordinary personal belongings arranged with exceptional care. Only after investigators measured the internal dimensions against the external shell did the discrepancy become apparent. The case possessed less usable storage space than its construction should have allowed. A concealed compartment occupied the difference. The hidden cavity contained several carefully sealed packages protected within moisture-resistant wrapping. The contents consisted not of narcotics, currency, or conventional contraband, but undeveloped photographic film, microfilm cartridges, encrypted communication sheets, and technical documents bearing no commercial purpose. None carried identifying markings linking them directly to any government agency. Their value lay in the information they contained rather than in the materials themselves. The discovery fundamentally altered the investigation. Transportation security officials withdrew from primary responsibility. Counterintelligence specialists assumed operational control. The airport, meanwhile, continued functioning without interruption. Passengers boarded flights unaware that a single suitcase had redirected the attention of multiple federal agencies. Rather than publicizing the seizure, investigators quietly substituted a visually identical replacement case into the baggage system. Their objective remained identifying whoever expected to receive the original shipment. Surveillance expanded beyond airport boundaries. Rental vehicles leaving employee parking areas were discreetly monitored. Selected telephone records were examined under warrant. Financial transactions associated with several airport employees underwent detailed analysis. Attention gradually narrowed toward one individual previously regarded as insignificant. The administrative coordinator responsible for repeated routing amendments maintained no unusual lifestyle, possessed modest financial resources, and had worked in cargo administration for nearly a decade. Yet investigators discovered that nearly every suspicious baggage transfer depended upon documentation prepared inside that employee's office. Without those administrative revisions, the luggage could not have moved through concealed routing channels. The coordinator was placed under continuous surveillance. For 3 weeks, investigators observed a life that appeared almost painfully ordinary. Work, home, occasional grocery shopping, weekend visits to a local library. Nothing suggested involvement in international espionage. Then, on the evening of March 29, the routine shifted. Instead of driving directly home after work, the coordinator followed an indirect route through several commercial districts before stopping briefly outside a small office building whose tenants included freight brokers, export consultants, and legal services. The visit lasted less than 5 minutes. No meeting was observed. No package changed hands. The individual simply entered the building empty-handed and returned to the vehicle carrying a plain document envelope. Investigators later confirmed that no business inside the building officially employed or expected the coordinator. The envelope disappeared before reaching home. Its contents remained unknown. The surveillance team added another unexplained event to an increasingly detailed chronology. By early April, federal investigators believed they had identified the operational facilitator responsible for manipulating baggage documentation. Yet one question continued resisting every interview, every surveillance report, and every recovered record. Who instructed the coordinator? No telephone conversations revealed clear orders. No financial transfers indicated direct payment. No consistent personal contact linked the airport employees together. The logistical network possessed remarkable discipline. Every participant appeared to know only the portion of the operation necessary to complete a specific task. Compartmentalization protected the structure. Then, during a carefully coordinated search of the coordinator's office conducted after normal business hours under judicial warrant, investigators discovered a locked filing drawer concealed behind ordinary administrative records. Inside were duplicate routing forms, coded shipment references, handwritten scheduling tables spanning more than 2 years, and a single notebook listing dates that matched nearly every suspicious baggage transfer Mercer had documented. Near the final page appeared one recurring notation. No name. No address. Only 3 handwritten initials repeated beside selected shipment dates. The initials belonged to no employee working at the airport. For investigators, they represented the first unmistakable indication that someone outside the visible network had directed the entire operation. The search had uncovered the facilitator. The person issuing the instructions remained somewhere beyond the airport, still unseen. By April 1984, federal investigators understood the basic structure of the operation but remained uncertain about its highest level of control. The airport employee responsible for altering baggage documentation had been identified. The hidden compartments had been recovered. The transportation methods had been reconstructed. Yet the individual who created the system, selected the routes, and coordinated the movement of intelligence materials remained outside the investigation. The case had reached the most difficult stage of any counterintelligence operation. The visible network had been exposed. The invisible one had not. The arrested coordinator became the primary source of information. Investigators conducted extensive interviews focused not only on the recovered evidence but on understanding the operational structure surrounding it. The purpose was not simply to determine what had happened at the airport. It was to discover how long the operation had existed, how many people had participated, and whether similar methods were being used elsewhere. The interviews revealed a carefully compartmentalized system. The coordinator had never met the person responsible for the entire operation. Instructions arrived through controlled channels, usually involving brief written messages or indirect contacts that provided only necessary information. The coordinator knew which forms to modify, which baggage transfers required attention, and when specific shipments were expected to move through the airport. Nothing more. There were no complete shipment lists, no organizational charts, no direct communication with senior figures. The individual responsible for the airport portion of the operation had been deliberately isolated from the larger intelligence structure. Investigators determined that this limitation was intentional. Whoever designed the network understood that every additional piece of knowledge created another opportunity for exposure. Participants handled separate responsibilities without understanding how their actions connected to a broader intelligence objective. The recovered documents provided additional information but few answers. Shipment dates corresponded with international political events, diplomatic meetings, and periods of increased intelligence activity during the Cold War. Some materials appeared connected to technical collection efforts. Others suggested the transfer of classified information between unidentified parties. The exact purpose of every shipment remained uncertain because many documents contained only coded references rather than complete descriptions. The investigation shifted toward identifying the unknown handler. Rather than making immediate public arrests, federal officials authorized a controlled continuation of the operation. The goal was to determine whether the unidentified coordinator would attempt to re-establish contact after the airport network was disrupted. Investigators reconstructed the conditions surrounding previous shipments. A replacement employee assumed the administrative position temporarily under federal supervision. Identical routing procedures were prepared. Similar documentation patterns were recreated. A controlled shipment was scheduled along the same international pathway used repeatedly over the previous 2 years. Every detail was designed to appear normal. The airport remained unaware of the operation. Passengers moved through terminals as usual. Aircraft arrived and departed according to published schedules. Baggage handlers continued performing the same tasks that had existed long before anyone suspected the airport had become part of a covert intelligence route. David Mercer returned to his ordinary assignments during this period. He was never placed inside the surveillance operation. Investigators considered his role complete. His value had come from noticing what experienced professionals often overlooked, not a single suspicious action, but a repeated pattern hidden inside normal activity. The controlled shipment moved through the airport on May 14, 1984. For several hours, surveillance teams monitored every stage. The baggage followed the expected route. The revised documentation appeared. The maintenance vehicle arrived near the loading area. Everything suggested the operation had resumed. Then the pattern changed. The suitcase reached the final transfer point, but no individual arrived to receive it. No unusual vehicles entered the restricted area. No administrative employee appeared to make last-minute corrections. No contact occurred. The shipment departed exactly as scheduled. Investigators initially considered whether surveillance had failed. Additional reviews examined airport cameras, employee movements, vehicle records, and communication intercepts. The conclusion became increasingly clear. Someone had recognized the disruption. The network had not collapsed. It had withdrawn. Over the following weeks, previously active patterns disappeared entirely. Telephone numbers connected to the operation became inactive. Certain employees requested transfers away from international cargo assignments. Financial records showed no unusual activity. The hidden structure that had operated quietly for years simply stopped functioning. The absence of evidence became evidence itself. A sophisticated intelligence operation had not been destroyed by a dramatic confrontation. It had ended through controlled abandonment. By late summer 1984, federal authorities formally closed the active phase of the investigation. Several participants faced legal consequences related to document manipulation, unauthorized handling of sensitive materials, and conspiracy charges. The airport employee identified as the primary facilitator received a significant sentence after classified information was excluded from public proceedings. The official explanation remained limited. Public records described an unauthorized international smuggling arrangement involving compromised airport procedures. The deeper intelligence implications remained classified. Much of the evidence collected during the investigation disappeared into restricted government archives. Names were removed from public documents. Operational details were withheld. The recovered materials were analyzed by intelligence specialists, but the conclusions were never fully released. The unidentified handler remained the central unanswered question. Investigators developed several theories. Some believed the individual operated as part of a foreign intelligence service using unofficial support networks. Others suspected the operation involved unauthorized activity by individuals connected to Western intelligence organizations. A smaller possibility remained that the airport network represented only one isolated segment of a larger system that had never been discovered. None of the theories could be confirmed. The initials recovered from the coordinator's hidden notebook were traced through multiple government databases but produced no definitive identification. The person behind the operation had avoided direct contact, avoided financial records, and avoided leaving evidence that could connect the airport activity to a specific organization or individual. The Cold War environment had created conditions where uncertainty itself could become a method of protection. Intelligence operations depended not only on secrecy but on ambiguity. A person could disappear behind false identities. A shipment could move beneath ordinary paperwork. A hidden network could dissolve without revealing whether it had succeeded or failed. Years later, the airport continued operating with improved security procedures, stronger document controls, and additional oversight of international transfers. The changes were introduced quietly, without public acknowledgement of the vulnerability that had required them. The employees who worked there continued to remember the airport as they always had, a place of schedules, aircraft, luggage, and routine. David Mercer eventually left the baggage department after completing more than 2 decades of airport service. He never became a public figure. He never appeared in news reports. His contribution remained buried inside investigative files as the observation that initiated one of the airport's most unusual counterintelligence cases. His discovery had not come from accessing classified information or understanding international politics. It came from knowing the difference between ordinary and unusual. A suitcase moved differently. A document changed unexpectedly. A pattern repeated too precisely to ignore. Those small details revealed a hidden operation operating beneath the surface of everyday transportation. Yet even after the investigation ended, one uncertainty remained. The airport network had been uncovered. The facilitator had been identified. The shipments had stopped. But the person who designed the system, the handler who remained distant from every captured participant, was never located. Somewhere within the vast machinery of the Cold War, an unknown figure had created a route through one of the world's busiest airports, used it for years, and disappeared before investigators could determine whose interests the operation truly served. The flights continued. The airport returned to routine. The records were sealed. And the final answer remained hidden inside the same shadows that had protected the operation from the beginning. 4:47 a.m., Tuesday, October 18, 1983. International Cargo Apron. By the time the first wave of passengers reached the terminal, most of the airport's most important work had already begun. Floodlights washed across rows of parked aircraft while diesel baggage tractors moved in carefully timed loops between sorting facilities and loading ramps. Every suitcase, cargo container, and transfer pouch followed a route determined hours before sunrise. Ground crews measured their shifts not by clocks alone, but by aircraft registration numbers, departure windows, and the narrow intervals separating one arrival from the next. In an environment where thousands of individual movements blended into a single uninterrupted system, routine became the airport's greatest safeguard against disorder. It was during one of those ordinary pre-dawn loading cycles that a single hard-shell suitcase briefly broke the rhythm. The baggage entered conveyor line 4 with a standard international transfer tag attached to its handle, yet it never reached the loading cart assigned to its documented flight. Instead, a supervisor with no responsibility for transfer baggage quietly redirected the case toward a maintenance access corridor normally reserved for aircraft equipment. The diversion lasted less than 40 seconds. No alarms sounded. No paperwork appeared to be altered. Within minutes, the same suitcase emerged from another service door carrying an identical baggage tag and continued toward an outbound aircraft as though nothing unusual had occurred. Hundreds of employees worked within sight of the exchange. None appeared to notice. One of them did. David Mercer had worked as an airline baggage handler for nearly 12 years. His responsibilities were neither glamorous nor particularly visible. He loaded aircraft holds, verified baggage counts, balanced cargo weight, checked routing labels, and ensured that transfer luggage reached connecting flights before departure deadlines expired. The work demanded physical endurance, but its greater challenge lay in maintaining consistency under relentless pressure. Every aircraft represented a mathematical problem of timing, weight distribution, and procedural accuracy. Mistakes delayed departures, misplaced luggage across continents, and generated investigations that few ground employees wished to experience.